computer. Okay, we're good to go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight for the first session in our new book series, our November-December book series. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone so that we can see who's here with us. We love to know who's in the room with us. Also, that will be where you can add your questions to our conversation. We are so delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for conversation and learning and connection. Thank you, as always, to Jewish Live for streaming. Before we begin our conversation, I'll say just a few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture through documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe very strongly that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us be poised to create a better world, which it really feels like we desperately need right now. The book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore all the different things we have to offer and projects and stories and exciting things to lose yourself in. Given where we are in the Jewish calendar, having just restarted the yearly reading of the Torah cycle, it is particularly exciting to welcome Liana Finck tonight and to discuss her new book, Let There Be Light, which is wonderful, which is a retelling of the Genesis story. Liana is a regular contributor to The New Yorker, The Awl, and Catapult. She's a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, a 6 Points Fellowship for Emerging Jewish Writers. She's had artist residencies with MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Headland Center for the Arts, and Willapa Bay. She's the author of a bunch of books, A Bintel Brief, Passing for Human, Excuse Me, and Now Let There Be Light. And I will just say on a more personal to JWA note, about 10 years ago, she illustrated JWA's Making Trouble Making History event in New York City, which was really fun. And I think when we first met, and I'm so glad to welcome you back to JWA tonight, Liana.
Thank you so much, Judith. I'm so honored to be here, and thanks everyone. I'm reading all of your hellos from different places.
It's always fun to see who is with us, and we always have a really great and warm community of folks with us. So I'm really excited to delve into this book. Those of you who are with us should just know that Liana and I actually got to have a conversation about her work with some other wonderful folks, including Alicia Jo Rabins, who will be with us in book talks later in this series. And it was really wonderful, and also just sort of like whet my appetite to talk about this more. So I'm really excited we have this opportunity tonight. So Liana, will you share a little bit do a little reading for us to introduce those who haven't read the book yet to the work?
Yes. Oh, right. Okay. Let me share my screen. Sorry.
It's okay. It always takes a moment to get set up.
Is it sharing?
Yes. Great.
Okay. First, she created the heavens and the earth. It was all basically a mess at this point, with darkness floating on the face of the depths. That was the beginning of disappointment. She lay there, unable to move, wondering if this was all she was capable of. Time or something passed. Finally, she opened her mouth and said, "Let there be light." And there was light. I'll call this one day, and this one I'll call night. Ooh, you know what? This is vintage. This is from the pre-copy edited version of my book from my own file. That's why it says one twice. And the first day was spent and gone forever. She was despondent, but only for a little. The next day, she drew a horizon between the waters below and the waters above. The former she called earth, the latter sky. Thus, the second day was used up too. On the third day, what have we here? I'll call it land. Next, she invented the color green. She went wild with it. And so the third day vanished too, but the days kept coming.
Thank you. So Tell us a little bit about how you came to this project. It's definitely a departure from your other work, and those who know you from the New Yorker know more of your kind of humorous observation pieces, and you've done sort of more historical pieces and more family pieces. But how did you arrive at this particular project?
I think of myself as I'm always a cartoonist, but I think of myself as working in two distinct strains. One is book length pieces and one is short cartoons, like New Yorker cartoons. And the last graphic novel I made was called Passing for Human, and it was a memoir about being a female artist and feeling out of step with the world in various ways. And it kind of braided together my own story and a kind of fictionalized version of my mom's story. My mom was an architect and became a painter, and I was a little girl who drew. My story was mostly me as a little girl, and I was kind of followed around by this strange, demonic, but kind of good shadow I could never make sense of, which was a metaphor for my shyness. And the story was about a lot of different things, and it was hard for me to make it linear. So it was a story told in fragments, and those fragments were what the fragments had in common was that they're about female artists and women creating. And I wove the fragments together by putting little bits in between them of adaptations from the book of Genesis, and I made God female. So that's where this character was born. She was the glue that held together my memoir, and my editor liked her and asked if I wanted to do a whole version of the book of Genesis with the female God. So that's where it came from. I would never have presumed to do it because it's been done. There have been a lot of Genesises.
Well, yours feels definitely very fresh. And I'm curious what it was like for you to live with the book for presumably a long time, since I know it's not a small project to do this kind of adaptation.
It was great. I've always had a little bit of trouble figuring out how to plug in my Jewishness. I was raised pretty observant, and I felt like the only shy kid at Hebrew day school and the only person who was too shy to sing at shul. And so I've always felt I felt connected in my heart. And I think the connection for me takes the form of really loving the text. And so this was the first time I kind of gave myself permission to engage with the text without beating myself up for not going to services and things and not being communal. It was great. I really miss it.
It's one of the things that I love about Judaism is that sort of ability to meet community on the page in some way, right? Like there's a conversation that's happening in a text or through a text, and you can be part of it, even if you're not. I mean, there's the kind of model of the Beit Midrash, right, of the house of study, where people are live in real life arguing over a text. But then there's also the ways that the texts often have, with commentaries, people talking across generations. And there's the kind of sense that Jews all over the world are looking at the same text at the same time if they're following the cycle of the Torah reading. And so there's like a larger conversation that you can plug into without having to necessarily be in a space with other people.
Yeah, it's always felt so paradoxical to me that Judaism is all about books. And when we think of people who love books, we think of someone like Jane Eyre, who's curled up in a corner with a book escaping. And it's also so much about community. I feel so much the first and so little the second. But yeah, but books are community for me.
Did you find, did working on this connect you to the text in a different way than you had before, or kind of open up a different way of looking at the text than you had before?
Yeah, I think it let me admit that I think I've always read Torah as just a story. I mean, I think I worship stories, and I think stories are the highest form. And yet, so to say just a story is not really what I mean, but I've never thought of the characters as good. I've thought of them as characters in a story, and I treated them as characters in a story in this book. I was kind of exploring their motivation, their different motives for things, and exploring their personalities, and kind of figuring out why they did what they did, but not trying to figure out excuses for how different things that they did were really the right thing to do and the good thing to do, as we so often do when we want God to come off as good and the patriarchs to come off as good.
Did you see yourself from the get-go as kind of creating midrash? I mean, I think a lot of people, including myself, would say this is a work of midrash and it's a really powerful one. Was that sort of your goal, or was it sort of accidental or incidental to the way that you were approaching the work?
It was definitely my goal. I adapted the Torah as literally as I was capable of, and it was kind of a stunt because I knew going into this that I would fail to adapt it literally, and a lot of things would need to change. The first change is that I made God a woman, and not only a woman, but like a 6-year-old girl, and a shy one, and a self-doubting one, because that was the God I needed. That was the role model I needed for creativity. And then there were so many things that I needed to explain in different ways, like why is Abraham so single-minded? I ended up turning him into kind of like a 19th or 20th century artist figure who's like embodies the myth of the genius, because that was how I explained to myself his kind of monomania and belief in this voice that's telling him he's special and he needs to go forward. Like that was my model of that.
It's obviously it's really powerful to see God as a woman, or and actually, as you said, not a woman, a girl, and just to see all the emotion that comes through. Like even just when I was looking again at the book today to prepare for tonight, and I was just seeing, like, even just in the first pages, there's so much emotion. She's disappointed, she's despondent, she's lonely, and there's like such an abundance of emotion, and really sort of overwhelming emotions, and you get the sense of God's vulnerability. And it's just not that the God of the Torah isn't emotional, but we don't see God's vulnerability in the same way. And so to have that youth and that vulnerability it is such a huge reframe. Why was it important for you to lead with, like you said just now that this was the God that you needed, but can you say a little bit more about sort of what about this particular version of God kind of unlocked something for you for creativity?
I guess I started with seeing what God actually is written about doing in the Torah, just destroying the world with a flood and asking someone to sacrifice his firstborn and then changing her mind. And I'm thinking, like, why, like, what's a relatable reason that someone would do these things? And I would do these things if I were God, but I would do them for different reasons than maybe a father figure God would do it. It would be less from wanting to show my power and more from frustration that I'm not a better artist. Like, I would destroy the world I just made because I would feel so embarrassed that I made something for everyone to see and it's flawed and it shows my limitations and it's embarrassing. I definitely destroy things all the time that I make. I hate to see my work on a wall. I hate to give someone a drawing. I always just I can't stand it. And I kind of trick myself into thinking that if something's in print, it's not really my drawing. It's just kind of an echo of my drawing, so it's fine.
I was going to say, it must be hard to see your work in print regularly if that's the case. But I guess if you see that as at a remove, that makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, somehow I've tricked myself into thinking it's a remove, but I also don't reread my work very often. And I really wish I could rework all of it. and I also work very fast. So that tricks myself into thinking, oh, this is just something I dashed off. It's not supposed to be perfect. And I think my God does all of those things. And I think I needed this God because partly for the same reason I needed, I think I needed her as an artist for the same reasons I needed this book as a Jew. Like I made a place for myself as kind of a shy, not very communal person and a female person in Judaism. And it was a very specific place just for me. And I'm a pretty specific artist. I think I have a lot more, I don't know about self-doubt, but real self-consciousness. Like I have this real hatred of being looked at, and that extends to my art. And that's tough when you're drawing to make a living. Like you want your work to be looked at. So I think I had to make this character is a little confusing. Like, why is she so full of self-doubt? And I don't know, but all I can say is that I am too, and that having company with someone else, even though she's a fictional character who has the same self-doubt, is really, really nice for me and gives me some permission to just embrace the self-doubt.
Oh, my dog is about to come jump on me.
Hi.
Sorry.
What a muppet.
My family forgot that I'm up here teaching. I think part of what was interesting for me in reading this is, it's okay, she can stay here. The ambivalence and the vulnerability of God was so striking because it was so recognizable in a female form in a different way. But of course, it also reminded me that that's true of the God of Torah also. And somehow, as you were saying, we have this need to make it not true in a certain way to sort of to explain it away.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think happens when you change something about God to something that's so different from the kind of mode that we have is that it just allows you to see all these other things. Like you were saying, there are a lot of things about the story that you made sort of literal, but in a new form. And so it sort of I don't know if I'm making any sense, sort of calls out what is actually there, but we couldn't see because it was in a mode that we've learned to see just as godly as opposed to as more human, because I guess we see women somehow as not in the God camp and therefore more relatable in some way.
Yeah, I will say that making God into this character came very, very naturally to me. A lot of the other changes I put into the book took a lot of thought and a lot of trial and error, but God was it just happened. I told you that it originated in a graphic novel. It actually preceded the graphic novel, and I drew it for a male artist I had a crush on, thinking he would love it. I had the God was kind of embodied me having a crush on him, and he was Adam, and it just came out of nowhere, and I just made it, and I thought it was good, and I sent it to him, and he did not like it. And I don't know why I sent it to him. It was such a weird, spontaneous thing that made no sense, and I didn't edit myself for once.
Well, that happens a lot in this story as well. We see God having just this kind of desire to share herself with the people that she's created, the men particularly that she's created, but then also being afraid that being laughed at, or being afraid that she'll be laughed at, and so therefore needing to hide herself. And that seemed to me to be one of the tragic things in this story, is that you have this female God, and then she pretends to be a man, basically, in most of it, certainly with Adam and in many of the other relationships that she has. Yeah.
The men that she makes are kind of her children, and she also is in love with them. And I think there's a connection between how you feel about someone you have a crush on when you're younger and you have these all out crushes, and the way you feel about your children. I think my crushes were very maternal, and that's why they were weird. what was the rest of the question? I'm sorry.
I don't even know if I asked a question, I was just reflecting on just the sadness of like God having to pretend to be a man in order
Oh,
to be
right.
acceptable to Adam and others.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And one other thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure she's afraid of being laughed at. I think she's afraid that she is wrong. Like there's something she's doing wrong and hurtful. I think I've thought hard about why I'm so self-conscious. And I think it has something to do with that. And I always wonder, like in that Margaret Atwood quote, where men are always afraid of being laughed at and women are always afraid of being killed.
Mm.
I'm afraid, of course, I'm afraid of being killed. I don't think I'm afraid of being laughed at, but I'm very afraid also of someone seeing me and seeing something startling and scary there and kind of backing away.
Mm.
And I don't know what that comes from. So God, I think God is this way. My God is this way too. And whenever people look at her, for instance, or whenever people come close to seeing who she is, like in the Tower of Babel, when all the humans make this big tower in order to see her face, she does really want them to see her, and she really wants them to love her, but something inside her is so sure that once they see her, they will not like her and back away, and she will have hurt them basically, that she lets them think she's a man, and she kind of keeps pushing that belief on them, even though she doesn't really like that no one knows who she is. And it starts with Adam. It starts with Adam naming all the animals, and he names himself, and then he names God a he. And she lets him think that, partly because of her own self-consciousness and partly because of her love for him. She wants him to have the confidence that she doesn't have, to feel that he's always right.
And the one who knows that she's a woman from the beginning is Lilith, who is the Midrash deals with the two different creation stories by saying the first woman who's created equal with Adam is Lilith, and that she is run out of the garden because she is too uppity, basically. And I love how you depict her in your version, where it's not actually clear that what her gender is, but she's not a man. You just kind of describe her as a monster of the night, and she doesn't want Adam to call her woman, but she sees that God is a girl, and she kind of keeps trying to like let people know that.
Yeah. So Lilith was one thing that I put into this book from Midrash and not from the text of the Torah. She's a character in Midrash who's made to explain why the creation story of Adam and Eve is told twice in the Torah. First, in the first version, God creates two people from earth, and they're man and woman, and then it just starts over, and God creates man, and then man is lonely, and then God creates woman out of man's rib. And the Midrash explains this story by saying that Adam actually had two wives, and the first wife was named Lilith. And so I brought Lilith into this book because I wanted a foil to the relentless self-consciousness and self-doubt of my God character. I wanted just a perfect id who knows what she wants and goes for it and doesn't feel bad about it and is a voice of honesty. And one of the things Lilith pushes is for God to tell all her creations that she's a woman, and God punishes Lilith partly because God is a bit of a misogynist and she loves her men, and she's kind of threatened by her female creations. And partly because of God's terrible fear of being found out and seen and not liked. So God turns Lilith into a snake, and Lilith becomes the serpent, and she kind of recurs throughout the story.
And she's the one who gives Eve the apple, and they have this exchange, which I think might be my favorite exchange in the whole book. I actually Xeroxed it and put it on my wall, where at first when Lilith tries to give Eve the apple. Eve refuses it and says, well, no, God said no. And Lilith says, God never liked me, and God doesn't like you either. But if we have knowledge, then we don't need to be liked. And that feels like such a piece of wisdom that Lilith carries through the book. And that is such a hard thing, I think, to learn. Like, I feel like I didn't learn that it's not that important to be liked until I was in my 40s. It was one of the great gifts of my 40s, actually.
Yeah.
So I just so appreciated that piece in there.
Yeah, it's hard. Because if you're not liked, you'll be lonely. Should I have the piece here? You want me to show it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So yeah, Eve has taken a walk without the man for the first time, and then she's being offered, she finds a tree with fruit. She's never seen it before, and then she thinks the tree can talk. It says hello. And then it turns out Lilith is in the tree. She's hiding out because she's been banished. And she offers Eve an apple. She says, it's knowledge. She says, God never liked me. God doesn't like you either. But if we have knowledge, then we don't need to be liked. And Eve takes it, and then she eats it, and then she knows everything.
And knowledge is very messy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But also gives Lilith, I guess, the strength to just be herself.
Yeah. Yeah. Lilith is kind of a Cassandra figure. I relate honestly equally to God and Lilith. I feel like God is me as a child and Lilith is me as an adult. And I kind of crusade for fairness in the world and in my marriage in certain ways. And I mean, I have a 1-year-old, and I've just felt misogyny pushing in a way that I haven't felt, at least in this way, until now, where it's so assumed that I'm the primary parent and that my kid comes before my career, and the kid doesn't come before my husband's career. And I really want equality in childcare and in careers. And knowing that just makes you seem like a mad woman, because like pushing for it just means the world pushes back even harder.
Right. People don't even hear you probably when you say it.
Yeah.
There's a kind of like undoing of all words that don't fit into the model that is still assumed to be the natural model.
Yeah, it's shocking. Like I was told that this is no longer the model, but it is still the model.
Yeah, I think that is one of the great, I don't even know what the word is, like paradoxes or just like gaslighting, or I don't know what it is of our time, is just like how many of us grew up with a sense of like what was possible, and it turns out that is just an aspiration. No one told us it was aspirational, not reality.
Yeah, exactly. And aspiring for it can make you very lonely. Yeah. But I also think anyone who's wrestling with this, please keep doing it. I'm continuing to do it.
Absolutely. And I think also, just to get back to what you were saying about kind of the power of books and of text, is like, that's where you can, like, to me, when I read something like this or other things where people are expressing things that like resonate as such truth that you don't hear all the time, and that challenge the things that are otherwise in the air around us, or the accepted narratives, there's a recognition that breaks the loneliness, because then you're like, oh, there's another voice there that I see, I feel seen, I feel heard, I see myself reflected. And that's, I think, why it's so powerful to for example, have a female God here is it's like, oh my God, I can be reflected in this. I can see my own vulnerability here. And that's why it's, just an incredible gift to be able to find that in other texts, even if we don't always hear it in the cultural narratives.
Yeah.
And as I'm thinking about it, also just the idea that it's Lilith who has the knowledge and the clarity about what knowledge, what the gift of knowledge is, and God actually doesn't, right? God hasn't in this version eaten from the tree, and so is like actually living in a more simple, less kind of clear, confident mode.
God doesn't have to keep pushing forward, even though the world doesn't accept her in a certain way. She's afraid the world won't accept her, but she never actually is told that the world doesn't. And Lilith and Eve are being told, like, they know that God doesn't accept them, and they push forward anyway. And there's something very freeing in that. Lilith and Eve are free in a way that God isn't.
Right.
In some ways, God, I modeled God after kind of my childhood self, but in other ways, I modeled her after older women I've known and very much admired who kind of came into their careers before feminism, who kind of, like, I had an art history teacher who was really, really powerful in college, who was so clearly used to being the only woman among a lot of men. And I don't think she was trying to bring more women in, because that wasn't the model back then. And I have so many feelings towards women like that. I admire them so much and relate to them so much, but I've moved on from that model. I also didn't come to feminism until my late 20s. I was kind of, I wasn't not a feminist. I definitely thought I wanted a career and I thought women should be equal, but I wasn't angry. I just wanted, I wanted to be a man, basically. I wanted to be a painter or a writer and kind of write about men the way male writers wrote about women or painted women. And I thought that would be possible. And it's not possible, because the power dynamic is very different.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I had writer's block, I think.
That's interesting.
But God is kind of that, like, there's this innocence. And I think the art that I thought I could make back then was so glorious, and it wasn't possible to make. But I think the God of the Torah is capable of making that kind of art. I mean, of my Torah.
I wonder if there's any way for God, though, not to be kind of lonely and alienated in a certain way, because they're the only one, right? So I think about this is different, and because it's history, but at JWA, we often are telling stories of people who were firsts, who were pioneers, which are really, really important stories to tell. But they also stand apart in this kind of like, they're the only one, they're the first.
Yeah.
And I've kind of reached this realization recently when people talk about like, oh, well, this person was really unique and special because she was the first and she was the only one who could do this. And I now just start from this basic assumption that that's just not true. It's just that we only know about that person. But I just assume that there were many, many other people who were doing the same thing and who just, we've lost those stories. And that because every time we put somebody into this box of like, they were special and they were the only one, then it doesn't actually change anything because they're an exception. They're not actually changing anything. And so I think we have to move out of that mode. And so but I don't know if that can happen with God, right? Unless you're going to create like a Greek world of gods.
And that would be really nice for her, I think, and maybe for us. But I wonder if some of those women whose story makes it appear that they were the only one felt that they were the only one. I think maybe my God feels that she's the only one, even though she's not.
Right. Like she could, I guess, have maybe more of a partner in Lilith if she weren't scared of Lilith.
Yeah, she could. I think it's going to happen. Like there's a hint at the end of the book that they're going to become more colleagues.
Well, that was one of my questions for you, is why you choose to end with Lilith as the kind of, she gets the last word. And she's reappearing, but we don't know exactly what for.
God, I don't remember quite why, but God forgives Lilith at the end of the book, and she gives her form back. She stops being a snake. And then the last panel is Lilith picking up some earth and looking at it as if she's about to create something of her own.
So maybe the answer is that maybe monotheism is the problem here. We need something that allows for more models of creativity that are simultaneous and not standalone.
Or maybe they're not simultaneous. Maybe Lilith is the next one. Maybe there's always one.
Right. I like that. One of the other reversals that you make in the book is in the retelling of Cain and Abel. Cain is the sympathetic figure. He's like trying to grow things and things are hard for him, and God rejects his cucumber salad and he's very, very sad.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to tell that story that way?
I think because I'm an older sibling, I've just always had a lot of sympathy for Cain. I mean, I get it.
Right. And he has this sad, he obviously has a moment of loss of control and commits murder, and that's very bad. But he also punishes himself. He sort of exiles and punishes himself as opposed to God putting that punishment on him.
Yeah, I don't think he understands murder. I don't think he would have done it if he had understood. It's still very bad. But like, I had a recurring dream when I was a really little girl and my brother was a baby that I had accidentally really hurt him, because babies are so breakable. And I was a 3-year-old girl, and I don't think I ever did gravely hurt him, but that was my biggest fear. And I think that's what happened to Cain. I think he was dreadfully sad that he killed his brother. And yeah, he does. I think the end of that story is that Cain realizes that all he'd ever been trying to do was recreate the Garden of Eden from his parents' stories, and that's why he was a gardener. And he goes off into exile after he kills Abel, and he realizes that he never will recreate the Garden of Eden. He's lost his chance.
I was gonna also ask about Abraham's story, which takes place in the present. And as you said already, is a story of an artist. So the promise that he receives from God is that he'll be a great artist, and the place he's going to get is the city that he comes to, sort of New York. And I'll ask another question about the place question, but tell us a little bit about Abraham and setting him in the present.
Yeah, so I had a lot of trouble with Abraham. The God part came really easily to me. I drew it in my normal style, which is this quick style with a very thin pen, and it's kind of childlike and unfussy. And I kept trying to, after I finished that section of the book, I kept trying to move on to Abraham, and I just got rid of draft after draft after draft, and it must have been a year or two. And I realized what the problem was. And the problem is that God is not a main character in the story of Abraham. I'd crafted this book as a book about my God character, and suddenly the book was not about her anymore. It was about this guy who has a single-minded vision and who heard a voice and who's going off to leave his home and has all these adventures involving real estate. And I found it very unrelatable in the way that I find the Iliad unrelatable, which isn't to say that I didn't like it. I like it, but it was just about a guy going off and having real estate dealings, and they were endless. And I didn't really relate to him. He was very sure of himself, and he was a little bit boring and a little bit dense. And I don't think he really understood his wife. And he was a good person in a way that is very unrelatable to me. He's not I don't think he was a reader. I don't think he was like interested in gossip. I think he just did what he felt was right. And he probably, I don't know, he probably told the same joke over and over. That was my sense of Abraham. So I had to figure out how I could access Abraham. And I realized that this type of person could also be a type of person I do very much relate to, which is someone who just knows that they're supposed to be an artist and they will do whatever it takes to be an artist. And the reason I can relate to this type of person is that I was this type of person as a teenager. I no longer am, but I felt that this was the model I had for an artist. Like, you must go to art school, you throw yourself into it, you must be the best painter you can be, and you will be rewarded with fame. So it was a very kind of, I don't know, 1950s era idea of the artist, this single-minded person who sacrifices their health and their friends and their family to their vision of art. And I think Abraham does kind of sacrifice his family and everything and his home and everything he loved to his vision of the promised land. So I replaced the promised land with becoming a famous artist in New York. And I drew Abraham in a different style because the kind of playful, casual style didn't suit that person. And I used kind of a parody of an academic drawing style where I used this kind of heavily shaded pencil. And that was really fun to do. I really liked working in that style. And because I'd made the creation story in the past and Abraham in the present, I decided to make Joseph in the future. So the book is told in 3 different tenses.
And Joseph, it's in the future and also partially underwater.
Yeah, I made Egypt into a mermaid haven of mermen, mostly men.
So we have a question about how you envision, do you envision this as a book that children would read, or sort of what ages can you imagine engaging in this?
I'm not sure. I wish I remembered what I would have loved as a kid, but I started to love adult books when I was around 12. And I think that was really my heyday for engaging with books. And so I think a 12-year-old would really get a lot out of this book. It might introduce them to comics and drawing, and I think the earlier the better. Yeah, so I would say 12 and up. But if a younger kid likes it, good, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that there's a lot of like complex emotional stuff going on here, but I also think a kid might just enjoy the drawings and skip, like, miss some of that, but that might be okay because there would be other things that would be conveyed through the art, through the images.
Yeah, it's also, I know it doesn't sound like it, but I tried to put in a lot of jokes.
There are a lot of jokes, and there's a lot of like sort of breaking the fourth wall in some way. Like, you address the reader directly in various places, like in the baguette section. You write, like, if you're easily bored, you may skip it. And there's sort of ongoing joke about how everyone refers to God as he, and you sort of have asterisks as being like, oh, God, you know?
Yeah.
So were you sort of thinking, were you trying to be in conversation with the reader? Like, what was your thinking about the role of the reader as you were writing it and drawing
I
it?
feel like when I make cartoons, like the smaller things that I make that are usually funny, like New Yorker cartoons and any very small, short, quick drawing, I'm always trying to be funny. That's kind of the point. And I'm always totally focused on the reader. It's a very direct interaction between me and the reader. And when I work on longer books, I'm often more in my head and kind of tunneling deep inside myself to find a story. And the assignment I gave myself for this book was to figure out how to interact more directly in a longer project. And that was part of why I chose the book of Genesis. I thought, if I can choose a story that everyone is already familiar with, I'll have more leeway to just like make jokes about it because they already know the story and I don't have to do all the work of explaining the story. But I was wrong, and most of my readers have not read the book of Genesis. So I realized that as I was working, that I really did have to do the work of explaining the story. But I think I figured out a way of kind of doing both at the same time.
Well, there is a lot of humor, and there is a sense of like incorporating the reader into the storytelling in some way. which I really loved. I loved also just like, it was clear to me from reading it that you knew the text really well and also were familiar with Midrash about the book. And so, I'm sure that plenty of people will read it and will not see those things. But like, one of the things that struck me is when you're writing about Isaac, and Isaac being sort of traumatized and never really recovering from the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac, and what changes about him from going from being like a joyful child to post Akedah is that his eyes change in your drawing. And there's like midrash about him being, and it sort of talks in the text about his eyes being weak. And so I love that you brought that piece in.
I didn't know that.
Oh, really?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm going
yeah.
to look
Well,
that up.
I
That's
think
really
it's
cool.
I think it's in the part about later on with Jacob and Esau.
Oh,
that,
yeah,
like,
yeah. No, that I knew. Yes.
but you sort of read it back into the trauma piece. And so I felt like, oh, well, that's where, like, you sort of anchored it in that. It felt like a way of taking that
Mhm.
piece and sort of anchoring it into the trauma, which I really loved.
That's so interesting. I don't know if I was thinking of him as having weaker eyes. I definitely drew like circles under his eyes. I was just thinking of him as someone who's been through trauma suddenly, and he just stops smiling.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Interesting. We have some other questions. One question is about what other graphic novelists would you consider yourself in conversation with?
Roz Chast, Saul Steinberg. Some of my favorite graphic novelists who I really wish I were like are Gabrielle Bell, Kyler Roberts, and Walter Scott. And I just read a phenomenal book by Malika Gharib, Gharib. That's, oh man, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting the title, but it's about her Egyptian stepmother, and it's just like really well written. These are all memoirs. Walter Scott is not a memoirist. He's just like such a perceptive storyteller and so hilarious.
Great. Well, I love those suggestions. Those are some new ones for me. There's a question also about God and whether you had any discomfort in anthropomorphizing God and how you kind of thought about that piece of your work.
I think we as a culture do anthropomorphize God, and I think it's really weird, but I guess I'm not someone who's like, we're all doing something wrong, I will lead by example by not doing it. I know a lot of people are and believe in God as a presence. I do kind of the opposite. I kind of demonstrate how weird something is by doing it really hardcore. So yeah. But I also I kind of merge my love of stories with my feelings about religion. So I like thinking of God as a character. I think I would have been very happy as an idol worshiper.
Speaking of idols, it was so interesting to me that you made Leah into an idol. So Rachel is a person, but Leah is her sister, but also idol. Why did you make her?
It was a lot of trial and error. It was since I said it not in the very past, it was very hard to figure out why it would be not like a total story derailing, strange horror to have a man marry two sisters at the same time, be married to two sisters at the same time. So I tried various ways of making that problem go away because I didn't want to dwell on that problem for the rest of the book. And the way I finally landed on was there's a thread of idols. It doesn't really come out of nowhere. I make idols be this kind of, I don't know, I just kind of tried to illustrate what idols seem like to me from the text of the Torah. And they seem like they're oddly threatening. God is strangely threatened by them. So I think they must be some kind of living being in some way for her to be so threatened by them. And so it starts with I brought in the story, the midrash about Abraham destroying his father's idols. So I think that's our first glimpse of idols. And then they just keep cropping up. And when Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to go find a wife for his son Isaac, and Eliezer goes to the house of, oh my God, I'm really
Of
tired. Is it
Laban,
Lavan? Yeah, of Lavan and Rebecca. I have Lavan kind of like being this kind of like twerpy little boy who's obsessed with idols and making them. And I think of that as kind of a computer geek. He's just like obsessed with making, I think in real life, he'd be obsessed with making computers, but in the story, he's obsessed with making idols. And so when Jacob runs away from home and goes and meets Rachel and meets her father, who's Lavan, he's still obsessed with idols, and he's become very good at making them, and they're humanoid at this point. And so like the story that I made is that Lavan loves his idols more than his daughter, and that's why he marries Jacob to an idol instead of to his daughter. So that solved it nicely. But I like having idols as a counterweight to God in a certain way. Like God is this kind of not exactly human character, and the idols are also not exactly human characters, but God is kind of greater than human, and the idols are kind of less like scarily uncanny valley, like a computer.
But also blank so that we can project onto them the same way that we do onto God, I guess, actually.
Yes, exactly. I think I've always projected onto objects much more when I was a kid, but I would really love rocks and stuffed animals and anything I drew, I'd really think that they were alive. So I think I was exploring that kind of innate animism in the idol characters.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about human beings that it's so easy to make other things seem real and easy to make real people objectified.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I
right.
know.
Like,
Yeah.
we're so kind to so many things and so cruel to actual people.
That's my worry, that because I think objects are people, that maybe I don't really understand what people are. And I think there's a bit of truth in that.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe it's easier for us to infuse other things with being than it is to deal with the actual being.
Yeah, we're so complicated.
We are. And I so much of that comes through in this. One last thing I wanted to ask you about is the relationship between Abraham and the city. And you talked about how you kind of replaced the idea of Abraham getting the promised land with Abraham, his fixation on kind of being a great artist. But at the same time, there is this connection to a place, to the city, which fits into the whole artist thing of like this obsession that like you come to the city and that's where you make it big. But it also felt to me like that it maybe, and you, I guess my question is, did this operate for you in some way as a way to offer like an alternative to Israel, to sort of say like there could be a different orientation or to explore that fixation on a place without having to, to be able to explore it in a different way by making it not Israel. So it takes us out of our.
Definitely the second thing you said, I wanted to explore the fixation on a place, and I didn't want to, I'm not the person who can talk about there's too much to say about Israel, and I'm not the person who should be pontificating about it, but I am really interested in kind of treating a place as holy, because I find that I do that all the time. There are places I need to go to once a week. And when I was in high school, I dreamed about moving to New York City, and I thought my life would begin in New York City and everything would make sense. And I knew all these people who had come to New York and made a life from books because I read their books. And I thought I would, in a way, I thought I would meet them when I came to New York. Like I would meet Elizabeth Hardwick or something. I don't know, someone I really, of course, wouldn't meet, or Saul Steinberg. I think a lot of people think that when they come to New York, they will figure it out. And New York is full of disappointed people for that reason. And that is a promised land I am equipped to talk about.
As you speak to us from New York.
From the outskirts of the city.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, like we've talked about text, we've talked about God, and we've talked about place, and and those are sort of the, like, in some ways, those are some of the Jewish locuses, right? Like, so it's all the different places that you can go to try to find Jewish meaning. And I think for many Jews, New York is the promised land. So
yeah, I know
that's fitting as well.
There's that. Yeah. I know. I always think it's this place, the birth, the home of artists, but it's also the home of my grandparents. Like it's where my parents were born. It's where my grandparents were born. So it's as close as a homeland that I have.
Right. Do you think you're going to continue working with biblical texts? Like, do you see yourself continuing on a midrashic path?
I'd really like to. That's interesting. I just want to keep telling stories and engaging with text in whatever way I can. And I definitely want to keep reading the texts, the Jewish texts. I don't know. I don't know. We'll see.
What are you working on now, if I'm allowed to ask?
I'm working on a book of parenting cartoons called How to Baby. I think it will be a lot less kind of complicated than this book. And then I have 2 more projects after that, and I'm working on a kid's book.
Fun. That's cool. Well, I am very excited to see those projects as they come to fruition. Thank you so much, Liana, for this conversation tonight, for this really, really wonderful book. I want to actually read a tiny bit from your author's note, which I really loved, and which this really struck me in relationship to the work of JWA. And of course, I don't have my glasses, so now I can barely see it. But you write, my real aim in making this book is to demonstrate that each of us is allowed to create God or gods in our own image, and that we must reshape the larger stories that are handed down to us, family stories, religious and cultural stories, our individual and collective pasts, and tell them in a way that feels honest to us. Stories need to be told and retold in different voices. That is how they breathe. And I loved that so much, and it really spoke to the way that I think we try to do the work we do at JWA, even though it's obviously in a different medium because we're working with history, but our mission is really about reshaping stories so that everybody can see themselves as part of the narrative. And our tagline used to be where history lives and grows. And we've actually kind of taken that back up to use on social media. And in some ways, I feel like that's similar to the idea of keeping stories breathing. So thank you for your amazing work and for being a kind of partner in the work of keeping stories alive and evolving and growing and making it possible for many of us to see ourselves in the texts of our tradition in new ways.
Thank you, Judith. This was really fun and really meaningful. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you. And I want to tell folks also, there's always more to explore at JWA. You should first of all buy Liana's book, and we will put a link to that in the chat. You can also read an interview with Liana about her version of a Bintel Brief, which is one of her earlier books, at JWA, and you can learn more about Jewish women's comics and graphic narratives in our encyclopedia. You can also see one of the images that Liana drew for JWA in 2013 on our site. And finally, I want to say a shout out to our friends over at Judaism Unbound. They had a great conversation with Liana recently about Let There Be Light. So if you want some more of that conversation, please listen to that podcast as well. Also a reminder that this is the first of our 4-part series, which is happening every other week this time in November and December. So please join us next time, which is in 2 weeks, not next week, November 17th, but same time, same place. That will be a conversation with the author Michael Frank about 100 Saturdays, which is an amazing story about Stella Levy and the Jews of Rhodes. And again, thank you, Liana. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Until next time, be well, and thank you so much. Have a good night.